All right, guys, today we are looking, actually, let's go back to the start here. Today we're looking at a house divided or sectional crisis, the issues that took place leading up to the Civil War. And it's really a series of events that create a cascading domino effect, essentially, of tensions and outright fighting that finally leads to South Carolina seceding and subsequent states following suit with the election of Lincoln. And so you see here, this kind of just gives a good overview, and I'm going to write these out in just a second, but westward expansion was a big part of that, because with each expansion came questions of would it be a free or slave state, and there was a lot of tension behind that. Manifest destiny played a huge role in this as well. With that why not just stop expanding? Well, manifest destiny is kind of the explanation for that. Of course, slavery is the key issue here with westward expansion. The issue of westward expansion only happens because of slavery. The states' rights, right, which is often touted as a reason for the Civil War, is only because of slavery and the issues of really politics, and the idea that if a new state comes in and it's free, that gives increased weight and opportunity to free states to have more political clout in the Congress. If it's a slave state, then southern states have more political clout, and they were teetering on this even status with each new expanding territory and subsequent state. That balance then becomes the center stage for it. So, right, the idea that the Civil War started for any other reason than slavery is not accurate in really looking at it. It's slavery, and then there's all these things under slavery or connected to slavery, as you can see here, that are impacting it. But the root cause was slavery, right? And then the issue of states' rights and politics and westward expansion are all connected to that. So hopefully that's clear in that sense of what's going on here. Let's keep that for now. So let's go here and we'll kind of get the kind of thing of what's going on. So if we start with, and now it doesn't want to write, there we go. Manifest destiny and tensions, because these are the things, right, that are taking place, or I guess I suppose you could say westward expansion with that, right? What are the tensions that are going on? Well, the abolition movement, right? The abolition movement had picked up a lot of steam by this point, and so one of the things that it was doing is it was keeping the tension, I suppose you could say, an issue of slavery, and more specifically, the North versus South idea. We'll say alive and in the forefront, right? It was constantly being brought up. And so not only was the issue of slavery constantly being brought up, but then the conflict between the North versus the South. This also put the South on the defensive. They definitely did feel like they were being attacked. And this is where you get all of those pro-slavery arguments, right? Because they were trying to defend what they saw as their livelihood, their way of life. Because remember, we looked at slave culture in the South, and it's a slave society. So economically, politically, and socially, the South was wrapped around slavery, all of those things. And so it really was like, oh, they're trying to destroy our way of life. And this also kind of made them more paranoid And that this idea that everyone was out to get them, and not just everyone, the North was out to get them. And we see this then when we look at South Carolina's Edict of Secession in Voices of Freedom. They mention it, the way that they talk about it, it very much is that paranoid sense that the North is out to get us, and their whole being is their whole purpose is to destroy us. The next thing, of course, is westward expansion. So westward expansion had always been something that was part of the United States, actually even before the United States, and something they wanted to, that people wanted to do and expand. But what creates here with tension, of course, is that you have two parts: new territories being brought in, and then, of course, the question of statehood. And with statehood comes free or slave state, right? And that was a concern, because ultimately the concern for both sides was a shift in balance in power in Congress. This idea, they were prior to kind of all this westward expansion that was taking place, you had equal 15 of slave and free states. And so it kind of kept this balance of power in Congress, and at least how it was seen. And so then the fear was that with each new territory that was coming in and that was becoming a state, it had what was seen as real political consequences if it was free or slave. And then manifest destiny. So manifest destiny goes to westward expansion too. I guess I could have put it under westward expansion, but that's okay. It'll be its own separate thing. This is manifest destiny is essentially the belief that America was destined by God to expand. So that it was like their God-given right to expand. And throughout, let's say, the North American continent. Now it's going to expand from there to worldwide, and maybe not everywhere, but this certainly later leads to imperialism and conquering like territories, Guam, and other things like that, Philippines and things like that. So long-term consequences, manifest destiny doesn't end at all from the Civil War. It continues on, and once you've found all the territory and space in North America, then they started looking elsewhere and saying, how can we have influence and spheres of influence in other places? But when you have this idea, and let's look here, if we go just to the couple of pictures here, this spirit, expansionist spirit. There's lots of images and things and documents written about this, with this idea of manifest destiny, of expanding, of conquering the Oregon Trail, expanding into California. This idea of both really its opportunity and the potential. And this idea that this is what you were supposed to do, right? That this was, I guess, more was meant for Americans. And that's where it's that God-given destiny kind of thing, that Americans were supposed to expand. This is a very common one, and that you see with manifest destiny, this idea of people setting out, bringing forth. She's bringing the power, so they're bringing technology, and this very much goes into imperialism later, this idea of technological advancement, and therefore that there is an obligation to expand and bring forth progress. Progress was definitely part of that in this image that you see here too. And so you see people setting out, and then you have this idea of course, settling down. with farming and a homestead and a house. Then you have the railroad here, which with the Intercontinental Railroad expansion was a huge part of that in connecting the West. Of course, you have some Native Americans here on the side and some people over here, but it was kind of this idea of continuing to expand and bring forth progress, to bring forth people settling down, creating farm. Of course, there's the ideal of land ownership as well, but you have this floating figure with a book and technology floating across in this kind of idealized sense, bringing forth knowledge and progress to the people, and that very much is part of Manifest Destiny. Okay, so the next issue, and we could put this, let's put Texas. We'll put Texas under here because it is connected to expansion and tensions that emerge from it. So Texas plays actually a really big role early on here because it ends up with several sections, if you will. The first, of course, is we'll say settlement. Oops. So Texas was actually originally under Spanish control, and then when the Mexican government ends up gaining independence and control from Spanish rule, they own Texas. And so what they end up doing is in the 1820s, with the end of Spanish rule, they want to look to shore up control and economic potential of Texas. There's also some concerns of securing the territory from Native Americans. And so what they looked to do was bring people in. And the people that they brought in were some Americans, not everyone. But what they ended up doing is that they ended up encouraging Americans to move to Texas. And the hope is that by having them come in and move in here, that it would strengthen the border. Come on, you can write. There we go. It would strengthen the border, provide that economic economy to Mexico, and provide that security. And so what they ended up doing is they granted Moses Austin, which is where you get Austin, Texas. And then later, Steve Austin. They granted him 18,000 square miles within the territory of Texas. But there were rules for the land, that they would become Mexican citizens and they would convert to Catholicism. Which they said, oh yeah, sure, we'll do that, no problem, because of course it's free land, and they're like, yeah, we'll totally do that, and then didn't, of course, in that process. Let's see, still settlement. We'll put it here, and of course one of the issues that comes with this is that the main people who moved to Texas were slave owners. And so they brought their slaves with them. And this is where you're going to have really the point of contention that's going to come in as Texas breaks away from Mexico and then wants to be part of the United States. This ultimately expanded to 25 settlements. So it became quite large of Americans who were supposed to become Mexican citizens and convert to Catholicism, and didn't, and instead brought their slaves in and set up plantation structures. Not surprisingly, we'll put 2 here. This created tensions between Mexico and the American settlers over control and power, where, not surprisingly, the Mexican government was like, you know, we kind of set up these conditions and you're not following any of them. And we want to have a little more control. And then the Americans be like, the Texans/Americans be like, yeah, no, we're good. And so they really, the Mexican government ended up feeling threatened, not surprisingly, by the settlers. And there definitely was issues with slavery, and we'll put control, and just the overall conditions of settlement that were not met, right? And so they ended up creating a new law that was supposed to give them more control. This was supposed to give the Mexican government more control and power over Texas and the settlers, specifically in slavery and taxes, and of course imposed citizenship. The settlers took offense to this, feeling like they were being targeted, which they kind of were. And so what ends up happening is in 1836, they declare Texas independence. And not surprisingly, this is not taken well by the Mexicans, and say, wait a minute, how did this happen in this situation where we were like, we gave you this land, but then you followed nothing, and now we are fighting you. And so ultimately, they ended up fighting Mexico. This is where you get, and we're not going to go into too much detail with this, just for time. But of course, this is where you get the Alamo. Remember the Alamo, which was, right, the famous line, remember the Alamo, became a rallying cry of support. The thing is with the Alamo that they lost badly. The Alamo, it's interesting because, like I said, it became this rallying cry to garner support. And in fact, to this day, like, you go visit the Alamo, it's kind of put on as this like daring, brilliant last stand against Mexico, except for it didn't go well, and they were way outnumbered. So give it to Texas to turn a loss into a win. But what this ultimately did is that they eventually, even though that Alamo didn't go well, they ended up being successful in signing a treaty with Mexico in terms of territory. And what this creates is, of course, the Republic of Texas, and that the treaty line was at the Rio Grande. So one of the things that they did with this is that there was a request. Texas sometimes pretends that they didn't do this, but they requested annexation by the United States to looking into having Texas become a state. And this is where, if we're looking at major tension in terms of sectional crisis, it's here. Of course, you have to understand the background to how it gets to this point, but this is where the issue comes in. So, of course, you have Northerners, not all, but there were many Northerners that were opposed. And they were opposed because, if you remember, most of the people that were coming in were slave owners, and they're opposed to a slave territory. They didn't want a slave territory, and they didn't want a potential for a slave state coming in because, of course, this is connected to the abolitionist views, the political ones that we talked about. And this was then also connected to Andrew Jackson and his fears. He feared that annexation would lead to sectional crisis, which I guess, in that sense, he was right. So, and what's funny is that what you end up having in a lot of this early stuff with Texas is like the presidents being like, don't really want to deal with that. They're like, how about not in my presidency? Can we just hold off and then some other president can deal with this? So you end up having like several presidents kind of like being like, oh yeah, nah, I don't want to deal with that. Oh yeah, no, I don't want to deal with that. And it feels to me like it really is just like, oh gosh, can we not, like, let's not have that mark on my presidency. And so what this ended up doing is it created a delayed recognition. All it did is postpone the inevitable sectional crisis, but it just slowed it down until 1837. Let's put that in there. There we go. And also, what it did do, which was interesting, so in terms of like trying to stall, it just stalled. But it did also create another issue, which was that Texas was not happy. And so they tried to go a different direction and said, fine, we will be our own country, right? We'll be our own independent country. We'll support ourselves. We'll be independent. This obviously doesn't go great. The biggest issue is money, and they end up in massive debt. They try it though. They created their own government and structure and said, "Woohoo, we're independent. We don't." Let's see, I was trying to think. I only had one, so we're on two now. That we're going to just be our own country, our own little separate independent nation within the U.S. It doesn't work. But they do try it, and it's mostly just because they were pissed that the U.S. was stalling and didn't really want, like, what? How could you not want Texas immediately? Okay, so the next part is still westward expansion, but continued tensions and issues with new territories. So I guess I'll just kind of write the areas, right? You have Arizona, California, Texas still comes up, and New Mexico. Which, if you notice then in this, right, if we're putting under this is still westward expansion. That's a lot of places, though. That was one of the key things with what was going on during this time, is so much westward expansion. And so every time it had to be like anxiety ridden of like for like the president, that every time a new territory was coming, you're like, oh no, is it going to be free or slave state? Because ultimately that was the big question, right? Or territory / state, right? Was it going to be free or slave? That was the kind of central aspect of what was going on with this. And you have several different things going on. There was with the Oregon Territory, which wasn't just what the state of Oregon is now, but it was a larger area. One of the things that emerged was conflict with the British. There was claims, both countries had claims to this, and there actually was talk of war, but ultimately no one wanted to get into a war, and so they ended up creating a compromise with the 49th parallel as the divider. So you look at, Canada versus the United States. And that kind of area. Now, not everyone was happy about this. Many thought that the United States should get all of that territory, but it did prevent any kind of further conflict from that. And of course, you have the Oregon Trail and people moving to Oregon, which became a very big thing. And the Oregon Trail wasn't just to get to Oregon. It was like a starting point or trail that then divided into going to California and Oregon as the two main areas of where people were going to. California, of course, is going to become a bigger thing because of the discovery of gold and the gold rush as well, which is also going to create crisis with Mexico ultimately in all of this. Okay, so there was also, of course, some question of like, well, what if we just combined Oregon and Texas into statehoods together? So one of the other things that's interesting with this, right, is that they were still looking for resolution. So the question was Texas and Oregon as states together, the belief being that this would create equal slave and free state, right? Again, all of this connected to political balance in Congress, right? So if we're already balanced, if we bring it both one at a time, and we'll see this method, by the way, this is like a foreshadowing to Kansas, Nebraska Act, where they do the same thing. Oh, we'll just bring in two. We'll try to get one to be free and one to be slave, and then people will be happy with that. And so this of ultimately was one of the questions. The other thing, put D here, was that then the interest in California with the gold rush brought in increased expansion and movement. This also, though, is going to create tensions with Mexico. That there were people already starting to move into California before the gold rush, and the gold rush just only even creates further tensions. But what really creates the tension with the Mexican War is going to be the admittance of Texas into statehood. So let's see, we're on E here. So Texas finally moves to be a state. And this is where Mexico's like, wait a minute, we didn't agree to this. They still had claims of what they controlled. There was also, more importantly with this, we'll say border or boundary disputes. Right, and what this did is that it was a boundary over. Texas claimed that the Rio Grande was part of their border, and another area where they were actually trying to creep in further into Mexico. Mexico argued that they'd actually agreed on a different border. And what happens with this is the president at the time, Polk, recognizes, of course, Texas's claim. And this ends up... well, what happens from this, it doesn't just immediately create a war, but there is suggestion that Polk wanted to fight Mexico, and he certainly seemed to push the issue and encourage it. What he did after he recognized Texas's claim is in the summer of 1845, he sent an army to protect Texas at the border, at the river, to protect Texas at border of, we'll say, Texas and Mexico. He claimed it was to protect Texas from Mexican invasion, but there's claims and evidence that he was looking for any reason to attack. What he really wanted is he wanted acquisition of both New Mexico and California, which were under Mexican control. And so he figured if he could provoke them, essentially. No, stop. don't do that right now. That then he could use as justification for seizing control of those territories. What he also did is he sent a commander of a fleet, of the Pacific Fleet, I'll say Pacific Fleet, to seize California. Get this in here. If Mexico declared war, so they didn't. Oops. If we'll say Mexico here, get who it is. So he was prepared. It really we're going to set up all our pieces, and then I'm going to try to goad Mexico into declaring war, so we have justification. Because really, that's what all of this was about. Is it's a little bit harder to just be like, oh, we're going to go to war with them because I want their land. But if you say, well, they attacked us, then you have clear-cut justification to get Congress on board to support the war and approve it, and then you get the land as well. And that's very much what he was doing here. He did actually try to purchase the land from Mexico, but Mexico said no. And so what ends up happening is he actually, when they said no, here we'll say, but they said no. So what happens from this is he actually moves army across the river, trying to goad them into Mexico into attacking. The Mexicans actually refuse to fight. So I'll say initially refused to attack or fight, right? And he was looking like he was going to have to start the war. And actually Polk was working up a plan to attack when, but then eventually did. But then they decided, or got orders probably, to push back against what was an invasion of Mexico. I mean, the acquisition of California, New Mexico, and even Texas was straight up just taking that land from Mexico, either through somewhat treachery on the settlers' parts in Texas, or provoking a war to justify it, to take it. Well, I guess you could say that we tried to buy it, but it's essentially like going up to someone like, hey, I like your car, can I have it? And they're like, no, I'm good, I like my car. And they're like, oh, okay. And then you just go steal it instead. Like, that's what happened, is we stole land from Mexico, which interestingly enough, World War I, the German government sent the Zimmermann Note, which was a note to Mexico from the German diplomat Zimmermann. And it was intercepted, which helped start the U.S. get involved in World War I. But the Zimmermann Note, the telegram that got intercepted, was meant to go to Mexico and basically say, like, hey, Mexico, like, we know that the U.S. totally took all your land. And, that's just ridiculous. And we would totally understand why you might want to invade the United States and take back, territory in New Mexico, Texas, and California. I mean, any reasonable person would. And the German government would totally support you on that. Not surprisingly, that helps push the U.S. to declare war on Germany in World War I. But, they used this event to try to get Mexico what they were hoping. I mean, it was stupid because ultimately it got the U.S. involved in World War I, which was not good for Germany. What they were hoping, though, is that if Mexico would declare war on the United States and attack them, trying to claim that they had a legal right to, this territory that we stole from them, many, many years before, that it would distract the United States and we'd be focused on a war with Mexico and we wouldn't get involved in World War I. But instead, it just got us directly involved in World War I. But that was their hope behind it. So what this ultimately creates is, what are we on? F here is the Mexican War. And this we were already talking about that. I'm going to, what it ultimately creates is the war, which we talked about, but I don't need to add as a separate thing. But it brings us into the war. We're not going to get into the details of the war. I got sidetracked with World War One stories here. So let's put forward. So what ultimately happens is the United States wins, and you have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And this treaty, within this treaty, this is where we then gain the territory, which creates a lot of the sectional crisis, right? Where, how do we bring it all back to the sectional crisis that we're talking about? It's this, is that Mexico agrees to cede California and New Mexico to the U.S. And then they acknowledge the Rio Grande as Texas border. So again, this is a massive amount of territory. And then in return, the United States promised to assure the claims of its citizens against Mexico and pay Mexico $15 million for the territory. What this ultimately creates, of course, is the tensions about slave or free. But now you have multiple places coming in. Right, the war ends and you gain all this territory, but what you ultimately get with it, that comes with it, is massive sectional debate and crisis that just continues to snowball, if you will, from this. So with the sectional debate, one of the things that had already actually come up was the Wilmot Proviso, and this was actually started when started when Polk tried to buy California and New Mexico. Because obviously there was clear intent and interest in this region, and so there was already tensions that were emerging from this. And he actually had gone to Congress to ask for money to purchase with peace. And so David Wilmot was an anti-slavery Democrat. So anti-slavery. And he looked to introduce an amendment that would essentially a new bill that would prohibit slavery in any new territory, which of course had the southern states up in arms to suggest that no new territories would be slave. And of course, you already had issues with the Missouri Compromise, which set the line of anything south of the line was slave, anything north of the line was free. And so the Wilmot Proviso was an attempt to try to prevent any further expansion of slavery as we continued to steal and acquire new land. Well, this didn't pass, right? So, did not pass. But what it does is it sets off a huge debate about how should we deal with all this new territory. Because obviously everyone kind of realized it was going to keep being an issue. So one of the things that became a leading idea, I guess you could say, is popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty is going to come back again. We see all of this gets connected to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, so we'll see this again too with this. But popular sovereignty became popular as one of the leading ideas. Of course, The main popular one for abolitionist anti-slavery groups was more like the Wilmot Proviso of no more expansion of slavery. All new territories and states had to be free. And of course, for the South, it would have been everything can be slave. But popular sovereignty was the idea that the decision for free or slave would be decided by the people that lived in the territory. Right, so they would vote and make their government and structure based on that, right? So the status of slavery would be based on popular sovereignty. The people that lived in those areas, you would vote to decide whether, when you're coming first as a territory and then when you were coming as a state, whether it be, actually usually by the time it came as a state, it would be decided. The idea was that if it was accepted as a territory, you would then vote for a government and then you would vote whether it was going to be free or slave, right? And then that usually determined how the state came in, whether it was free or slave. So by the time you get to statehood, it's already usually a free or slave state. And so the territories is where these decisions are being made that kind of end up creating that. So this didn't end anything. Popular sovereignty again became the most talked about, I would say, and kind of agreed upon as maybe the only thing that was going to work. But you continued to have massive conflict with the admission of California, and then, of course, possibly New Mexico and Oregon, Utah, all seen as this was potentially upsetting the balance, especially because why the Compromise of 1850 that's going to come in, why the tensions, is because it was assumed and looking like that California would come in as a free state. And then you had more kind of outrage, uproar, concern with Oregon, as I mentioned, New Mexico, and Utah. And the concern was that all of these could be free. And that's a lot of free territories and states that then shifts the political balance. And so what happens from this is that you have even moderate Southerners. And this is important. It wasn't just radical Southerners. It was moderate Southerners started to discuss secession, because they began to look at this and see a future where they would be outnumbered and all that, and then that would be an easy fix for Congress to just outlaw slavery altogether. And so this part right here, the fact that it was moderate Southerners, concerned a lot of people, because they said, oh, it's not just the crazy radical Southerners anymore. We have now moderate Southerners saying that they might need to secede because of what's going on. So the Compromise of 1850 was set up by Henry Clay, who proposed that what they needed was a compromise to prevent secession, essentially. Right, Henry Clay was huge on this idea of compromise, and so he spearheaded and led the discussions and decisions for the Compromise of 1850. Ultimately, it was a Band-Aid. It didn't fix anything. All it did was stall. It held off things a little bit longer, but you would have ended up with the same result. With that ultimately, and one could argue created the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that was much stronger, that was horrific in terms of what it allowed with that. But Henry Clay had really hoped that if he could create the right compromise, it would ease tensions, pull back. And I guess technically in that sense it did, because you had at this point talks of secession, and the compromise did pull people back ever so briefly, not for very long. But it did for a little bit of time. there were 5 separate bills. Sometimes it's written as 6 in terms of a slave trade versus slavery. I'm just going to combine one that's into so that it's 5. I think on the PowerPoint I gave you it says 6, but I'm really just combining 2 of those into one for that. So sometimes these 5 separate bills. Sometimes I've seen people, with with here talk about it as 6 on the PowerPoint. So as long as you have it's the same information though. That's my point. The one here versus if you've already looked at the PowerPoint, what I'm going to write is the same stuff as what's on the PowerPoint. I'm just not breaking apart one of them. I'm putting how it's jointly together because I see them as together. So the first, because this was so contentious, they couldn't even make it into one bill. They had to separate each one of these bills and vote on them separately. So I think that shows how tense this was, because the goal originally was that they put forth this compromise, and then you'd vote on it, yes or no, as a whole. But there was no consensus and no agreement as a whole. They had to create separate bills and vote on them in order to get it to pass. So the first was that California be admitted as a free state, right? And then the next was that any the remaining land that was acquired from Mexico, that the territorial governments, those territory governments would not have restrictions on slavery. So that's not saying they would be slave state. Just that they would not have restrictions. So this is where the idea of, again, popular sovereignty comes in. That they would be able to choose, that they at least wouldn't kind of say none of these states, they can't be slave states, that kind of thing. Then good old Texas would stop its conflict on boundary disputes, and they would yield the boundary dispute with Mexico. And in return, the U.S. would pay their public debt as they came in as a state. Right? So stop fighting with Mexico. We'll pay off your public debt from you trying to be independent, and you're going to stop arguing with Mexico about what you control. The next is that the slave trade would be abolished in District of Columbia. But what's with this? So Columbia, but slavery would not. And this is the one that's split up on the PowerPoint there. But it really was connected to this idea that they would find, because District of Columbia wanted to actually abolish slavery. And so they said, no, okay, we'll abolish the slave trade, but the federal government can't interfere with slavery. And then lastly, and the one that becomes the most contentious, is a new and stronger Fugitive Slave Act. So there had been a previous slave act, a Fugitive Slave Act, but the argument was it was too weak and ineffective, and that the North and there was no consequences for it, and so this was meant to appease the Southerners. It very much was put in to appease the Southerners, and it was significantly harsher and created massive tension with that. So we're going to look at that independently here. So there had always been tension with runaway slaves, escaped slaves, or as the South called them, fugitive slaves. Because, of course, so as with all of this period, tension between North and South, specifically the idea of the North and abolitionists, specifically, encouraging and aiding escaped slaves, which the South complained about and said that they were helping steal their property. And the argument, of course, about, well, if they get to the North, they should be free. The South claiming that the North was trying to destroy their way of life. All of that. The other thing, even before the Fugitive Slave Act, was, of course, that the slave catcher was one of the most hated occupations. It wasn't even particularly well liked in the South. Of course, it was seen as worse in the North and with slaves. But there's several reasons for it. One, most slave catchers were extremely cruel. They were notorious for being brutal to captured slaves. They generally were kind of creepy men anyway, let alone just the cruel treatment of slaves that they captured. There were issues of the fact that many times they essentially kidnapped a free person and brought them back to the South and made them a slave, claiming that they were an escaped slave. And we have several narratives of people who were born free and were kidnapped in the North and put into slavery. And so, of course, this was also a huge issue, tension. And then, of course, the fact that they went into the North and what the North saw is disregarded Northern laws, or we'll say individual state laws. They often acted like they were allowed to do whatever they wanted. So they were seen as horrible people. As a result of all of this, what ends up happening is that 9 northern states, they end up saying that what they did is they passed personal liberty laws. And what these did is essentially say they would no longer cooperate with federal recapture laws, such as the Fugitive Slave Act and things like that. And this, of course, as everything with it, pissed off the South. They weren't happy and said, you can't do that. That's unfair. Of course, saying that they were, look, they're targeting our economic prosperity and way of life. The North, this also is going to lead to, this is going to be connected to, see, all these things are connected to stuff. The Dred Scott decision that we'll look at. The North believed, or many people, again, the North is not the whole entirety of the North. It definitely was not that homogenous, but the people in the North, many believed that the slaves were legally free once they were in the North, right? Because the North slavery was illegal, and So they said, therefore, that once they made it into the North, they could no longer be slaves because slavery was illegal, which, of course, the South said, no, that doesn't matter within any of this. So the Fugitive Slave Act was created to try to appease the Southerners from further action against the Union. So what changed, right? Because there was already a Fugitive Slave Act. So what changed oops, I guess we could clarify there, with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850? Well, one of the things that it did is it greatly increased the power of slave owners or slave catchers to cross state lines and not have to follow state laws and rules. And technically with this, the federal government now supported slave owners or slave catchers. Right, the federal government was giving its support behind recapturing slaves. It also added that fugitive slaves were entitled to a federal hearing before being taken back to the South. But the problem with this is that the potential slave, because right, they weren't always slaves, it was sometimes free people that were captured, is that those who were considered slaves, right, were not allowed to talk or defend themselves. So unless they had a lawyer, which sometimes abolitionists provided, but sometimes these hearings were taking place and you didn't know. So they weren't allowed to testify on their own behalf. So even if they had the evidence to like, look, I've got this to prove that I am not a slave, I was born free, you couldn't show it. And unless you had someone else there that could present that information for you, you were screwed. So the hearing was meant to be like, see, look, we're making sure that people who aren't slaves aren't being taken back to the South. It was a farce, and this caused a lot of tension. Specifically, besides, I mean, all of these did. The federal government involving, but this one actually caused people who showed up and freed and raided one of the jails that an individual was being kept at, and for the hearing, and freed them and ferried them off to Canada. And there were also some riots and protests because of the hearing issue. And then this one also. So I really actually just had all of them pissed off the North. The sectional crisis is always just a continually pissing off either the North or the South. But this was a big one. Is that any citizen who aided fugitive slaves, so anyone that was helping with escaped slaves, the Underground Railroad, in any way, and that was a very broad term, which was also problematic, they ended up facing federal penalties and punishments. So now, helping an escaped slave was a federal crime, and that also created mass unhappiness and of course problems, because then it was meant to dissuade people from helping escape slaves, and for some it probably did. Others it just redoubled their efforts. And really all this did, so like what's significant about this is all this did, even though it was originally created to pacify tensions between the North and the South, all it did was increase tensions and hatred between North and South. So it did the exact opposite of what the creators of it wanted to do, which is, I suppose, kind of like everything also that's kind of going on. No matter what you tried, it tended to have the opposite effect. The pen's not wanting to write. There we go. So yeah, they tried that. The purpose of this was to try to appease both sides, and it really was put in for the South. So I would argue that it was really meant to appease the South more than the North, because they were already pissed about California coming in as free. They felt like the compromise didn't have any benefits for them, and so then they're like, okay, we'll throw in the Fugitive Slave Act. And instead, it just inflamed. Out of all the stuff in the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act is what pissed people off the most. This eventually, these continued tensions and aggravations, lead to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and what becomes called Bleeding Kansas, because of the violence and killing that takes place because of that. Okay, for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, how it got started is actually with Stephen Douglas. And what he wanted with the continuation of westward expansion and the Transcontinental Railroad, was to have the railroad have it go through his city. Right. Because, I mean, there's benefits. It also was for political benefit. He figured if he could get this major win and have it directed through his region, then that would be a big win for him. Of course, there was other arguments for this, the strengths of the northern route, that west of the Mississippi would run mostly through land that was inhabited by Native Americans, so redirecting it through his region and having it go through there would be a benefit. And so what he ultimately did is he introduced a bill. This was in, so there was a bill in 1854 to create a new territory. Which would be Nebraska. And the idea with this is that then you could have the railroad go in the direction he wanted. So the whole you could argue that the entire bloody conflict of Bleeding Kansas was because of Stephen Douglas. Obviously, it's not just him. It was also because of the increasing rising tensions between those that were anti-slavery and pro-slavery, of course. But this kick started it off, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas are often described sometimes as like the first bloodshed of the Civil War. Because this was the first time that we see people willing to kill and fight for slavery. I mean, and I guess you could also argue at a larger level that it's not that hasn't happened before with individuals, but you had a much larger body of people that ended up fighting and killing each other over this issue. So yeah, you definitely could argue that individuals had killed and fought for slavery before, but at a much larger scale issue. It also showed how much people were focused and concerned on this, and that the tensions weren't going to end. So this was kind of like the writing on the wall of where the country was headed. After these events, the reality was that there wasn't going to be a resolution for this that didn't involve fighting. Hindsight is 20/20. It's easy to look back on it now and go, oh yeah, duh, this clearly, that's the precursor to this. But there were a lot of signs at this point in time that compromises like the Compromise of 1850 weren't going to work. And that the only resolution was going to be a decision to either, I guess, allow slavery anywhere or end slavery completely. There was not going to be an ability to continue this half and half. And Lincoln, will look at the Lincoln-Douglas debate that I had you read in Voices of Freedom. He spells that out, and that's the whole House divided. It cannot stand the idea that it either is going to be, it can't be half free, half slave, that this doesn't work. And so I think that if you're looking at like what's the larger significance of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and subsequently more, I guess, connected to Bleeding Kansas, it's that this became the clear-cut factor that the United States was not going to be able to continue with this half-slave, half-free structure. It just wasn't going to work, and no compromise was going to be able to solve it. It was going to have to go one way or the other. And the only way that was going to be resolved, because both sides were adamant, was war. So there's the larger significance for you on that one. Okay, so he created the bill to create territory. Now, what he did know is that he knew that the South, it's always would not be happy. It's always that people, the North or South, would not be happy, and they wouldn't support it. And we'll say no support because Nebraska, it would come in as a free state. And this is because of the Missouri Compromise. So again, where based on where the line was drawn on the map, anything north of the line was free, anything south of the line was slave. So based on location, Nebraska would come in as a free state. So of course the South was going to oppose that. And so what he decided to do in an attempt to get Southerners on board is that he created a provision in the bill that said the status of slavery in the territory would be determined by territorial legislation, which is popular sovereignty. So again, that popular sovereignty is coming up again, and it was a safe attempt because again, popular sovereignty was seen at this time as still potentially a solution. Right, we're fine. We'll just let the people decide, and then how can you argue against this? So what this ultimately does, though, in order to do this, because remember, Nebraska-Missouri Compromise has to come in as free, is that in order to have that provision work, he created an additional clause to repeal the Missouri Compromise, which was seen as a big deal to do that. And then, because it was still assumed that Nebraska would probably come in as a free state because of its more northern connection, because just doing this alone and say, okay, yeah, Nebraska, well, we'll let them choose. The South would be like, no. They're still going to come in as free. So good job, you let them choose, la-di-da, because you already knew the outcome. So in order to finish this off to where the South could agree, he ended up saying there would also be a creation of two territories because of the pushback and stuff, which would be Nebraska and Kansas. So then, of course, let me put the last part here. Ooh, that was weird. Kind of didn't pick up the writing there. So the Kansas... the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed and became law in May of 1854. So again, Nebraska really wasn't the issue. It was all going to come down to a focus on Kansas. That is where the potential for having it be a slave state. So this leads to Bleeding Kansas. and what happened with this, right? So as I mentioned, everyone already assumed that Nebraska was going to be free. And so the focus was fully on Kansas because it wasn't as clear-cut as Nebraska. Now, popular sovereignty is supposed to be done by voters who live in the territory voting for territorial legislation, which then would be what would be determined for it moving into statehood. And instead of that, what happens is that you have white settlers that immediately begin moving in, and not even really like moving in permanently. They begin flooding in for the vote, moving into territory to vote, which is not legal. You can't just go across the border to vote and then go back, right? These people weren't flooding in to move permanently. They were moving in for the election and then planning on leaving. And so what you had is in 1855, elections were held. And this shows, of course, the amount of fraud and issues with popular sovereignty when you don't have strong procedures to prevent illegal voting. If we have now, like, you don't need massively strong, just what we have now to check verification of legality of voting is sufficient. They didn't have any of that. Of course, you didn't have IDs back then. You didn't have permanent address where you were getting statements of your where you could register and prove that you lived there. None of that existed. You didn't have to live there for a certain period in time. You were just supposed to actually live there versus just, I'm visiting for a while, I'm going to move temporarily. So elections were held in 1855 and held, and there were only 1,500 legal voters based on the people that they knew permanently lived there, but more than 6,000 voted in Kansas. So, right, the whole popular sovereignty will work clearly didn't. What ends up happening then, the result is that you have pro-slavery forces technically won, I guess. They won based on over 6,000 people voting that didn't live in the area. They ended up electing a majority to the legislature. And thus, if the people that were going to be in the legislature were pro-slavery forces, not surprisingly, what they did is they moved to immediately enact a series of laws legalizing slavery. Of course, this here's the outrage and unhappiness. This outrage, what were called free staters, which was, of course, the Northerners and abolitionists and everyone else, but the free staters were very ardent about all states coming in as free. And they ended up they defied the legislature. So the free staters. I wrote free states. Free staters were part of a political party. That's right. So they were the ones that were also elected to the legislature, but the pro-slavery forces, I can't speak anymore tonight, the pro-slavery forces were had a larger majority, right? So that's then where the name comes from, is part of a political party. So they defied the legislature, and elected their own delegates. Oops. So basically they're like, nah, we don't recognize your government, and we're going to create our own constitution. I was going to write convention. So what the delegates, the pen is not working for me today. Come on. Hang on, I'm trying to get this to work here. That was, you can't see what I was trying to do. I kept trying to write it. So they elected their own delegates to create a constitutional convention, of course, to create their own constitution. So they just totally ignored the election. And of course, this was going to exclude slavery. With this, the president at the time, President Pierce, he sided with the pro-slavery forces and said that the Free Staters were traitors. So that didn't help them not much in that situation. But what's significant about this is by kind of labeling them as traitors, is it kickstarts off I don't want that to come up there. Random news. It kickstarted off then a decision by people to arrest them. And so they didn't do it right away. A few months later, a pro-slavery marshal assembled a large group of people to go arrest the Free Soilers, because they were still there working on the Constitutional Convention, and they were claiming that the win was illegal and that they won. Right, and then based on the President Pierce's support, felt that they had justification to do this. They specifically were targeting the leaders of the group with their headquarters in Lawrence. What ends up happening, though, is that they do arrest them, but then they don't just stop there. And this is where part of the problem was, is it was really more like a mob arrest than an official arrest. They also looted the town, which was not part of what they were supposed to do, and they killed several Free Soilers. So instead of just leaving it or arresting, right, they looted the town and killed people. Not surprisingly from this, then, we'll put here that there ended up being retribution against pro-slavery forces. The main person was John Brown, who was an ardent abolitionist. And some considered him too radical because he advocated forcibly for violence to end slavery. Others saw it as what was necessary and needed to end slavery. Nonetheless, even by abolitionists and Northerners, John Brown was seen as more of a radical. And he gets involved in John Brown's raid with Harper's Ferry a little bit later, which also pushes the South towards agreeing, deciding that secession was necessary. He gathered followers to attack, and they went in at night. But it wasn't just like arrest. There was no arrest plan, and while they were sleeping, murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers. They also mutilated the bodies specifically to, as payback. It really was part of that was payback, but also to discourage supporters of slavery from staying or entering into Kansas. So they not only went at night and intentionally murdered people, they mutilated their bodies too. Not surprisingly, this led to further fights and death and conflict and all of that. So it created just a domino effect of people murdering and killing each other and attacking and looting and all of that. All right, we're going to look at, let's see, I'm trying to think of one more thing here. I think we're on 6 here. Let's look at the Dred Scott decision. So you had the westward expansion and territorial legislature and politics as a center that we were talking about. The next area or realm where there was going to be a focus was with the Supreme Courts. First in the state level and then in the federal level. And this was centered around Dred Scott. And Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri. And his owner was a physician. Oops. So, and why this was important, because he was a doctor who traveled to many states, including free states. And he took Scott with him. Scott was like his assistant slave still, but helped him with like cleaning the tools and supplies, and so that's why he traveled with him. So he took Scott to many of the states that he went to. So what happens is, though, he dies, so owner dies and leaves slaves with his brother, and his brother was an abolitionist. And so what they wanted to try is that they first agreed that either way, Scott would be free. But before he freed him, they wanted to test the court system. So this really wasn't about whether Dred Scott would be free or not, the court case. It was really to see whether that they could take the route of fighting slavery through the Supreme Court, and specifically challenging the Fugitive Slave Act, which had slave catchers were allowed to go into the northern states and retrieve/kidnap slaves. And if they could get the Supreme Court to say that Dred Scott was actually free because his owner took him into northern states, that would nullify the Fugitive Slave Act. It also would allow for an increased push of runaway and escaped slaves. And so there was hope around this, that this potentially could open up opportunities and potential for ending the Fugitive Slave Act and potentially aiding slaves. So the first case took place in Missouri, right? So they took it to the Supreme Court in Missouri and sued for his freedom on the grounds that residents in a free state. So the idea of the court case was that residents, since he stayed there for a while when his owner went to these different states, so residents in a free territory or state made him a free man. So that was what they sued based on. And the court decided against him. Didn't need to pop that up there with the time. So they decided against him. So the next case went to the federal Supreme Court, right? So that didn't work in the state. take it to the main Supreme Court. So they moved it to the federal Supreme Court because they could, because it involved multiple states, right? So if you cross state lines, you can have a federal case. And again, regardless of the final decision, Scott would be free, but the hope was to have a federal decision on slavery in the states and territories, and nullifying the Fugitive Slave Act was a big part of this. The Supreme Court was, we'll say, majorly divided, extremely divided with this case. So much so that they actually struggled to come to a decision on a single ruling. And so what they ended up having to do is they released separate decisions on each of the major issues. It's kind of like the Compromise of 1850 is, right, they couldn't vote and agree on the whole. So they actually had to divide it up and rule on each of the major issues, which is crazy because they had not done that. And then on top of that, I mean, this shows how divided this was and how heated this Supreme Court decision was. Each judge wrote a separate opinion. Usually, you have one judge that writes the majority opinion for all the judges, and maybe a judge who writes a dissenting opinion, maybe, if they feel strongly enough about it. So that, like, not every judge writes about their ruling. One judge does for the majority decision, and if there was a single judge or two that opposed it, but it still was enough to pass, and they voted on it and it passed, the judges that didn't vote on it, or judge that didn't vote on it, they could choose to write their minority or opposing opinion. And again, they don't always do it. It's not a requirement, and it just depends. Usually they do it when they have a strong reason that they want to explain why they opposed it, or if they're really strongly against the decision that was made. To have every single judge write their reasoning for their opinion is a big deal. Worse, however, was we'll put outcome here. This had devastating effect, short term, I suppose, considering that ultimately you end up in civil war, but it was the exact opposite outcome of what they wanted. It was like probably the worst possible outcome was actually the Dred Scott decision, because it didn't help them at all, and in fact hurt them and gave the South a huge win, which only bolstered the Southern resolve to continue with what they saw as their legal right, now supported by the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, to slavery. So that's the larger consequence of this, is not only did it continue to increase tensions, but it gave the South a legal justification for their right to slavery at the Supreme Court level, and bolstered their resolve, really, in that sense. We'll start with the final decision. Favored the South. All the decisions were for the South, and specifically said that the Constitution guaranteed the existence of slavery. So this alone is a massive blow, because now you have the Supreme Court say, the Constitution guarantees the right to slavery, right? Then you aren't going to be able to fight this in the courts. Worse, though, if they would have it was bad enough if just with that. But instead, Chief Justice Roger Taney couldn't just stop there. He added more, and it just got worse from there. Like I said, just saying the Constitution guaranteed the existence of slavery is bad. But then what the Chief Justice wrote next expanded it and made it worse. He said that Scott was not a citizen, right? Because he was a slave, and actually even because he was black, he was not a citizen of not only Missouri, nor the United States. Right, and therefore, because he was not a citizen, and more specifically that no black person, right, so one, it wasn't just that slaves are not citizens, that no black person could qualify as a citizen, right? So it just kept, every single one of these I'm going to write was a massive blow to the abolitionist movement and to the North, and had no rights under the Constitution. So technically from this, what they were saying then is, so technically Scott can't even bring suit to the Supreme Court. I'll put that under here. What the consequence of this is, could not bring suit to court because not a citizen. And what it's saying, though, is also that no black person, free or slave, can take anything to the Supreme Court to challenge what's going on because they're not a citizen and they have no rights. But then he went further and said Scott's northern stays had not affected his status as a slave. And it's not done. The reason it had not affected his status as a slave is because slaves were considered property by the Constitution, by the structure, and therefore, because they're property, the Fifth Amendment prohibited Congress from, or the courts and everything from taking property without due process. So the other thing with this is it's saying that Congress cannot change the law to end slavery. It's also, of course, that they're essentially saying slaves are not considered people. Right, and so one of the things that this does, the Dred Scott decision was horrible. Horrible for the implications, for what it was saying about not just slaves but black people in general, and the complete and utter disregard for them as even human beings. The other problem with this is that then the idea that Congress can't take away property without due process of the law. Law meant that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Right. So then it adds that to say technically you can't say that slaves or that territories and states north of the line are free. This, of course, made the South happy, emboldened them in all ways, because now they could claim that they had the legal rights to this. And on top of this, it devastated abolitionist Republicans, Republicans were largely in the North and against slavery. Lincoln would be part of the Republican Party. The Southern Democrats were for slavery, right? So it's kind of a reversal at this point of how the political parties align. The Republican Party was much more liberal, and the Democratic Party was much more conservative. And then those roles switch later on in U.S. history. And the Democrats become much more liberal and the Republicans become much more conservative. Republicans ended up threatening to reverse the decision when they claimed or if they gained control of the government. So I'm going to put, so let's see, consequences of this. And this will be the last thing. I didn't get quite as far as I wanted to. I want to talk about the emergence of Lincoln and John Brown's raid and the secession. I will just start with that with next lecture that leads us into the Civil War. So this will be the last thing here. The consequences with this, and we'll look at those two sources with next the last week's lecture there. So consequences with this, of course, is one, the South was not only happy, but they now had legal standing to support their claim of slavery, which certainly gave them a stronger position. Technically, if we hadn't moved into Civil War, this could have opened up states to slavery, right, with an increase in slavery. And then what you also had was Republicans, as I mentioned, threatened to reverse all of this if they won the election. So what's not surprising with this is that when Lincoln won the presidential election, right, the South said, uh-oh, because we'll look at his speech with the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right, is that Lincoln kind of made clear that he didn't think that the part slave, part free could last. He was not for slavery. He wasn't an abolitionist, but he wasn't for slavery. And they saw that along with John Brown's raid and the events of Bleeding Kansas, and all of this as a threat to them. And basically they saw this as that when Lincoln won the presidential election and we'll say John Brown's raid, that the North and now we'll say president and / because of that federal government would what they saw not follow the law, and they saw that as a direct threat that was now backed up, which led to secession and the Civil War. So while we still have, of course, the election of Lincoln and John Brown's raid that we're going to talk about next time, which also lead to the decision for secession, this event and the reaction of the Republicans and what the South saw as a legal win, but then watched as the North basically dismissed it, was directly influenced their decision to secede. So it was a huge deal. It was also a huge blow, of course, to the idea of slaves as people, and really to the abolitionists. It just didn't end up having much impact legally because Civil War came instead. Okay, so we're going to end there. I'm sure I'm long, yeah. And I'll pick up on the last couple of things, and there's just a couple. It's pretty short what I have left to say with Lincoln and John Brown's raid in Lincoln, and then we'll move right into just finishing up that same part. We'll then talk about the Civil War, and that's the last lecture for this course. All right. So we'll talk about basically the Civil War is what we'll be talking about next time, but I will mention the two sources that I didn't get to today because they're on Lincoln-Douglas debate and South Carolina's secession.